I still am researching a little bit. I'm working on a paper right now for ACPQ, American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, the big, American Catholic Philosophical Association, which is the biggest Catholic philosophers association. I'm guessing in the world, definitely in America. Anyways, I'm writing a paper for a special issue on distributism. So I got invited to write something on that. So I want to try to put together my kind of version of distributism, which is sort of this post-liberal, new polity kind of version of distributism, and see if I can articulate that a bit for a broader philosophical, professional audience.
Well, let's see. Doesn't C.S. Lewis say the mark of an intelligent person is if you can bring these heavy concepts down to lay
That's
people?
right.
So if you can make me understand it, you're probably good to go.
I can try if you want me to.
Yeah.
So I think of distributism,
which has been now renamed localism by some, yes?
Yeah, I get that, and I see the motivation, but I'm going to stick with the old word.
All right.
And I can tell you why if you want to, but so I think of distributism now as a framework, a kind of social philosophy framework. So it's really Catholic social teaching with just as much emphasis on the philosophical dimensions as we can. So not the specifically theological revelational grounds for it. So things that would be available to anybody. So that would be in old school language like natural justice, right? So we want our social order to be one of natural justice, corresponding to that order. So it's inspired, of course, in the history of it by Chesterton and Belloc. There's other ones like Vincent McNabb and a whole bunch of other people in history in England. So it's kind of contextualized there. So that's why I like making it a framework. And so the framework to me, there's basically three enemies and one sort of goal. So the goal is that society should be healthy, which means healthy families. So number one, the healthy family. Like the family is the basis of society. It is a society, and its health is a barometer of the rest of the health of society. So that's sort of the aim we want.
What does that say about the health of America then?
Absolutely. And I mean, I watched the episode you did with Jones, and of course he's a friend of mine, and a lot of his thinking has influenced me. But his rail against liberalism as kind of anthropological individualism, at least that element of it, is directly diametrically opposed to distributism. So it's like man is social by nature, man is familial, man is in these solidarity networks by nature, right? He wants to preserve that sort of peace in those networks. And when that spreads around out through society, then a society is healthier than if it's not ordered by some other principle, right? That's violating that sort of natural condition of man. So it's like, we believe God made nature, nature's good. And so if we're natural in that sense, then that's good, So that's the kind of...
What does a healthy family mean?
So I think a healthy family is obviously one where there's love, right? There's mutual love between the children, between the spouses, between the children and the parents, right? And Augustine defines peace in the family as one where there's a proper order between the ones commanding and the ones obeying. So that is the order, obviously, of society, where there's commands or rules, laws, right? And then there's obedience to those laws, and there's usually some sort of purveyor or keeper of that law, right? And of course, we think the law ultimately comes from God, which is why we think that an order is we Catholics think an order is justified, right? Is just to the degree that it's following natural laws, right? The moral law above. So humans don't create laws, right? The laws that we make either correspond to the real ones, and so they're really laws, or when they don't, then we say with Augustine, an unjust law is no law at all. So we just call it one, but it's not really one. So obviously, like, laws permitting abortion are not really laws and never have been. And I think if we would take that lesson to heart, I think we'd have a more powerful conviction when we're doing theoretical stuff, in the pro-life movement. Still got to get boots on the ground and do stuff. But just like, this has never been justified. This can never be justified. This never was a law, right? So any authority that says it is can't really be authoritative, right? But it's just acting in a tyrannical mode. So I think so. A healthy family is one where there's that natural peace between the members, and there's mutual relationships of love. Now, what that requires for the distributists, the number one thing they thought was the problem in the modern era was that the proper share in productive property was being expropriated from families.
Okay.
And so you need productive property. You need assets, right? You need material goods. You need not just material goods for food and shelter now, but for provision for the future. So any family that's constantly anxious about what's going to happen tomorrow, it's very difficult being a flourishing family in that situation.
Puts a lot of stress on a family. Yeah.
So that's where the name distributism came from. We want families the number of families in society that have property should be distributed as widely as possible. So that productive asset should be distributed to as many families as would mark that society as one of distributist property.
What is productive property?
So we think of like, something that you can use, right, productively. So obviously you could use your house or your tools or your garage or your car. These could be productive property for you. There's also, we have financial assets, right, could be. So any sort of, and it's a tricky definition when you get to theory, but basically something that's useful to you that can be used to produce something for you. So think of if you had your land and your tools, right, and your house and your equipment, machines and whatever to run. It's easier to think of it in an agrarian setting. It's not required. But
that's a good question. That's what's going to be my question. Does it mean I have to have acres of land? And
no, it doesn't mean you have to, but
yeah.
I do think there's a naturalness to having an agrarian foundation that can't be avoided because man is material and we need food.
Yeah.
So no matter what, we need farmers. And of course, to me, a society that has massive agro-biz has a lot of problems associated with that. And obviously down over at New Polity, that's part of the shtick, is the good soil, that podcast. And it doesn't mean we all have to become farmers, right? Because most of us don't live in rural land and have to live in a city. So how do we do that
or may not
consistently?
desire
Yes,
to.
or may not desire. Or even if we did, like I desire to, but I would break. I'm getting too old. I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And the amount of knowledge required it's such a learning curve that even if I got the knowledge and I was physically fit, it would be so difficult to transition it's just impossible for most of us. But it should be something that we look out for and we care about, even if we don't ourselves do it. But my point was, in an agrarian setting, it's easier to imagine that notion that I said, productive property. So think of if you lost your job, like how would you survive, right? A lot of people, if they lost their job, they wouldn't be able to survive, right? They would have to get somebody to help them. But if you have your own productive property, let's say, then you would have more what Belloc called economic freedom. So you wouldn't be utterly dependent on an employer at all times because you have something to fall back on, right? So that's one way to think about productive property is the things that you could fall back on to sustain your life, out of which you could produce things, the means of production. So it would be like kind of capital and labor, right?
Well,
and
this would require skill. People would have to have skill in order to use the property.
So you need what we call human capital, I guess you could call it that.
Yeah.
So you'd need skill, you need knowledge, you need material stuff, you'd need maybe the tools or whatever to work with, you need land. So
interesting.
Back in the Middle Ages, they had the guild system, right? You've probably heard of that.
Yeah.
And so there you'd have like people as part of a trade or whatever would share capital, right? And then they would use that, let's say machines or knowledge or whatever to then, in a non-competitive way, be able to have access to that more continuous. And then it would form a fraternity as well. And so they would have like their own chapel, their own prayers, right? Their own sort of spiritual devotions. And so even though people are doing trades and in a certain sense, in a competitive environment, competition was not the name of the game, right? Because these guild systems limited that. So Belloc, when he talks about the transition from the pre-modern to the modern era, he talks about that's one of the major things that changed, right, is these sort of solidarity networks that were naturally part of trade and economy were broken down. And so now there's sort of an unrestricted competitive field. And that creates some of the problems of excessive competition.
Excessive competition, but there would still be competition, presumably.
Yes, but not unrestricted.
Even in a guild.
Yes, there would be. But he tells the difference between restricted and unrestricted competition.
Which means what?
So unrestricted, not restricted by the framework of the guild. So like if you let's say cutthroat your guy in the guild, right? Then you're out in the guild. Like now you know how long you have access to this fraternity and these resources and whatever. Right. So that naturally limits the kind of way you would compete.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. Before you go, do us a favor, leave a comment, let us know what you thought of the video, like, and subscribe.